In the height of steam preservation and restoration, people searched far and wide for engines to save from scrap and restore to full working order. Some engines were simply a little rusty, while others were so rotten they needed most of their parts fully replacing. Restoring a locomotive from a decrepit state isn't a new thing, but there's one story of an engine being found and restored that stands out over the rest, and it takes place in Brazil. Engine number 12 was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1878 for use on the Estrada de Ferro Madeira Mamor, or Madeira Mamor Railroad as it was later known, in Brazil. The line was built to meter gauge, and soon after it arrived, engine number 12 was named Coronel Church. The engine ran on the line for a while, and I can't find any reports of it ever being involved in an accident. The line was ran by a few dozen men and was a mere 6 kilometers long, but it was soon closed down in 1879 after most of the men working on the railway contracted and died of yellow fever. As a result, the locomotives and the railway were left abandoned. Number 12 was supposedly taken by local villagers and was used as a hen house, a bakery oven, and the tender was used as a water tank. After that, it was eventually abandoned and left in the rainforest. In 1909, 30 years after the railway was closed, railway officials surveying the area stumbled across the engine completely overgrown and surrounded by the forest. The firebox was full of plants, hundreds of insects had made residence in the cab, and a small tree had started to grow out the engine's funnel. Surprised by this discovery, the surveyors had the engine dragged out of the forest and taken back to the locomotive works in an attempt to restore it. After some work, the engine was fully restored to working condition and was put back into service on the 4th of July 1912. It continued to work in Brazil and was eventually withdrawn in 1940. The story behind the engine's career led to it being preserved, and is now currently on display at the Madeira Mamor Railway in Porto Velho, Brazil. Just goes to show how rugged human engineering can be, and no matter what state something might be in, it's never impossible to try and make it work again. When building a railway, it's important to make sure that you lay the rails on solid ground. Trains are heavy things, and the ground dipping just a little bit can be enough to cause an engine to derail if it's travelling at high speeds. Land subsidence isn't a new thing, and there have been cases of rails shifting out of place thanks to soft and loose ground. There was, however, one case that was very extreme indeed, involving a Furness Railway D1060 and a rather unfortunate placement in a siding. It was Thursday the 22nd of September 1892. A 7 AM morning goods train had stopped in a siding near Lindal in Furness. The driver was shunting the engine when he suddenly noticed cracks opening up in the ground beneath the locomotive. He quickly shut off steam and both he and the fireman jumped from the engine. No sooner had they done that, the ground opened up a sheer-sided hole 30 feet wide and roughly 30 feet deep. The locomotive fell in front first, with the tender remaining on the surface. The rails it stood on were snapped off, and the tracks on the two main lines either side of it were partially left suspended over the hole. Passenger trains passing the area made passengers disembark from their coaches and walk around the hole while the coaches were carefully rolled past on stable pieces of track. People flocked to see the hole, and police and railway staff had a hard time keeping people back. Some onlookers spread rumours that a whole passenger train had gone into the hole and many were killed or injured. This was untrue, but it kept people staring at the mess in wonder. Workmen brought in a crane and tool van and positioned them on the sturdiest parts of the line in an attempt to retrieve the engine. At 2:30 PM, while the men were on break, the hole collapsed another 30 feet down with the locomotive buried by dirt. Witnesses were awestruck to see a machine of such size simply vanish from sight. The hole became even wider, causing all 8 sets of track to become twisted, making none of the rails safe to use. Because the line carried important goods, such as coal coke for the nearby ironworks, it was vital that it be made stable as soon as possible. Trainloads of ballast were brought to the hole in an attempt to fill it. Eventually, it took roughly 300 wagons of ballast to fill the hole in and re-level the rest of the tracks. Nobody is 100% sure why the hole appeared in the first place, but the current explanation is a mixture of both land subsidence and old mining tunnels. The area was known to be affected by subsidence as trains were explicitly instructed to to slow down while passing over that part of the line. Other nearby fields were heavily affected by land subsidence too, with a farmhouse having to be abandoned for this reason. There were also 2 levels of mine beneath the part of the line that collapsed. The upper level was abandoned, but workers on the lower level could hear engines passing overhead and predicted there would one day be an accident. It's suspected that the area had a large deposit of sand beneath it and that an underground stream had washed it away. This was further backed up by the fact it had rained heavily and flooded a few days before the accident. The mines, also having a history of caving in, only further helped weaken the land. Rather humorously, the engine is still buried there, and as it was never officially scrapped, it's currently recorded as preserved. It's unknown how deep the engine is buried under the ground, with most speculating around 90 feet while others say deeper. Over the years there have been some attempts to unearth the engine, but none have ever gone further than the planning stage. So I suppose for now it'll just have to stay where it is. But at least we know it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. Sometimes while walking around a river, you might find something interesting buried in the bank. Many people make a hobby out of searching for trinkets and treasures, finding all sorts of things from arrowheads to old coins to even, if they're lucky, gold. What many people don't expect to find while digging around riverbeds is a steam locomotive, never mind 15 of them. As railways developed and workloads got bigger, it was natural that newer, more powerful and up-to-date engines would be needed to do the work. This of course led to older, less powerful engines becoming obsolete and in need of disposal. New Zealand Railways found themselves in need of disposing of some redundant steam engines in 1927. However, they also had a few other problems to deal with. At the time, the value of scrap metal made it very uneconomical to break up or sell any rolling stock they had, meaning they were stuck finding alternate ways of disposing of their obsolete engines and wagons. On top of this, much of the Southland Plains was made up of loose rock and mud, making it difficult to keep the heavy railway lines stable. A particular point of trouble was a bend in the Oreti River near Branxholme, which was prone to eroding. Large rocks and other debris was tipped along the bend, however, this was prone to washing away after heavy rains and flooding. This was a problem for the railway that partially ran beside the river and the rail bridge that crossed it. Looking for solutions, New Zealand Railways tried to find alternatives for reinforcing the embankment. With a load of engines in need of disposal and a riverbank in need of reinforcement, it was decided that some of these engines would be dumped into the river to form a sort of defensive barrier to help prevent erosion. 15 retired engines were stripped of any useful parts and taken to Branxholme, where they were tipped into the river by a steam crane. These engines included a J-class, 4 Ks, 2 Ps, 5 Vs, and a U-class. Several old boilers were also dumped at the site, as well as locomotive tenders and parts of several U-class engines in the 1950s. Locomotives were also dumped in this manner elsewhere in New Zealand, such as Omoto and Oamaru. The barrier the engines formed wasn't perfect, but it worked much better than the rock barriers they replaced. As the years went by, the river shifted and newer reinforcements were put in place, leaving the site where the engines were dumped accessible. Naturally, it became a point of interest for sightseers and rail enthusiasts alike, as some of the engines were partially exposed, making it a fascinating site to explore. It also became a point of interest for scrap metal hunters, who have tried to salvage copper from the engine's fireboxes and bronze from the wheel bearings. By 1971, steam power had been phased out in New Zealand, and as such, enthusiasts put greater efforts into finding and restoring or preserving older steam engines. Some attention was focused on the Branxholme embankment, and in 1974, one of the K-class engines was dug out and taken to the Plains Vintage Railway to be restored. As the years have passed, more and more of these engines have been dug up, either to be preserved, restored, or simply for spare parts. Sadly, 4 of the retrieved engines were too damaged to salvage and were outright scrapped, while the rest still remain in decrepit condition. The only exhumed engine to run again is K-class number 88, the first engine to be retrieved and successfully restored to prove that it was plausible to do the same for other engines retrieved from embankments. While we're yet to get another river engine restored to working order, it was all thanks to the work done by enthusiasts to restore number 88 that efforts are still being made to this day to recover more of the engines. So, overall, while it's not exactly a perfect happy ending for all engines involved, New Zealand's riverbed engines tell an interesting story of railway development and camaraderie around rescuing locomotives that most would consider not worth saving. Let's hope then that any future endeavours to rescue these engines goes well, and hopefully that no more engines will get put into the river again anytime soon. In the 1960s and 70s, the race was on for steam locomotive enthusiasts to try their best and buy and save whatever steam locomotives they could from the scrapyard in hopes of preserving them for the future. From terriers to peppercorns, people were trying their best to save these steam machines. There was, however, one man that may have unintentionally made a massive contribution towards saving some of the London Midland and Scotland's finest express engines. Sir William Billy Haygate Edmund Colborne Butlin was born in Cape Town in 1899, but moved to Canada with his family at a young age. He became part of the Canadian Army and served in the First World War, deciding to stay in England afterwards. There he joined a travelling fair running a hoopla stall. He made his games easier to win, which resulted in more business, which went on to allow him to purchase more and more stalls, eventually leading to him running his own fair. Over time, he managed to set up several amusement parks all over the UK, with some in England, Scotland, Wales, and even the Isle of Man. These eventually became holiday resorts, with lodgings for guests as well as meal services, on top of the attractions available such as rides, carnival games, and zoos. During the Second World War, some of the resorts were used as training camps by the army, and others located close to the sea were used as navy establishments. After the war, the massive economic boom allowed Butlin to expand his empire into Ireland, with plans to eventually set up a resort all the way in the Bahamas. He started construction of a camp in Bermuda in 1949, but by 1950 the project was abandoned and sold off due to American tourists showing little interest in the holiday camp style of vacation. From then on, he focused more on maintaining his holiday empire back in Europe. In the 1960s, Butlin felt that he needed some new attractions at some of his camps, and as such decided to purchase several redundant steam locomotives from British Rail, who were starting to replace steam with diesel power at the time. The idea was to simply leave the engines on a section of track as an interactive display piece, where visitors could simply climb in and out of the engine's cabs and mess with the controls. He purchased two former LMS locomotives, number 6203 Princess Margaret Rose and number 6100 Royal Scot. Both were cosmetically restored and taken to holiday camps, with the Princess going to Pwllheli in Wales and the Scot going to Skegness. The Royal Scot was one of the LMS's most well-known engines, having been sent to America for an exhibition and being used for much publicity by pulling expresses. So when it arrived at the Skegness site on the back of a Pickford slow loader, it was greeted with the pipes and drums of the 1st Battalion Royal Scots. Butlin knew how to get good publicity. Later, he purchased another 6 steam engines, 2 LMS Duchess engines, 3 former LBSC Terriers, and an old shunting tank engine. All were cosmetically restored and displayed at various parks. It wasn't, however, until the 1970s that people realised the unintentional significance of Butlin's engines. While there were already plenty of Terriers preserved and little demand for old shunting engines, the 4 big LMS engines were all express locomotives, with the 2 Duchess engines famously streamlined to head the Coronation Expresses being 2 out of the only 3 left. Only one other Princess Royal existed outside of the camp, and only one other Royal Scot, Scots Guardsman, was spared the cutter's torch. Had Butlin not wanted a few more tourist attractions, the engines would have likely been melted down or simply left to rust. After 10 years, Butlins had started to lose interest in the now rusting engines, so several small groups formed to purchase the engines for preservation and restoration. One of the Terriers ended up restored in the Isle of Wight, with the other 3 tank engines either being restored or saved as a static display. One of the Duchess engines was streamlined again and is on display at the National Railway Museum, while the other was restored and runs various enthusiast specials as well as visits smaller preserved railways. The Princess locomotive was towed out of the park on the same railway it arrived on and moved to the Midland Railway, where it still resides and operates. Lastly, the Royal Scot was moved to the Bressingham Steam Museum, where it fluctuated between running and being a static exhibit. It suffered many mechanical issues while in preservation, but those are a story for another day. So what's the moral of this story? Actions have consequences, but not always bad ones. If Butlin had not purchased the engines for display or not wanted a new attraction for his parks, then we wouldn't have had the chance to preserve some of the LMS's finest express engines, which otherwise would have been lost to the Cutter's torch. So maybe it's not so much actions have consequences, but more, sometimes you don't realise the significance of your actions, but time will make you see that more clearly? Whatever the moral of the story is, let's just count ourselves lucky, eh? In dire situations, people tend to want to stockpile things, as most of us found out in 2020. Food, water, fuel, soap, and even toilet paper are items usually on the top of the list for most people. But then there are some who, for one reason or another, put steam engines at the top of the list. After the Cold War started, both the US and USSR put emergency plans in place in the event the Cold War ever became hot and Armageddon arrived. Russia at the time was working on modernizing and electrifying many of its rail lines, but by the late 60s realized it'd all be for naught if something were to happen to the power grid, be it destroyed via bombing or disabled via EMP. Given how vital railways would be in such a scenario, the USSR needed machines that would be able to operate without electricity, and so they decided to keep some steam locomotives in reserve. Most steam locomotives are purely mechanical, simply being a load of metal parts that require nothing but fire and water to function, meaning they wouldn't be affected in any way should the power grid fail or an EMP go off. On top of this, while most engines require coal for best performance, they can still run on anything flammable provided it burns hot enough, such as wood, oil, or even gas, making fueling them relatively easy in a situation where large fuel supplies become inaccessible. Naturally, steam locomotives were more awkward to maintain and less efficient than diesel or electric engines, but in an all-out nuclear Armageddon scenario, that wouldn't really matter too much. All across Russia and the USSR, steam locomotives were taken out of service, repaired to working condition, and stored in old warehouses, stations, military bases, or even just old sidings. These engines varied from relatively modern engines built in the 50s all the way to engines built as early as the 30s from all over the USSR. What makes this plan especially interesting was that these engines weren't just parked and forgotten about. They were frequently maintained and kept in working condition long after steam power had disappeared from most countries around the world. For years, these engines stood, parked in sidings, ready to be steamed up and deployed should D-Day ever come. Luckily for us, Doomsday never arrived. Most engines in these yards were frequently maintained until 1991, when the Soviet Union finally dissolved. Afterwards, the threat of the Cold War died down, and as a result, the engines were deemed unnecessary to maintain. Some were just outright scrapped in the 90s, however, quite a few were purchased by museums and put on display, especially some of the older engines, as they were some of the few surviving examples of their kind left. Even museums as far as China have taken an interest in the engine. Many of the remaining ones have simply remained untouched, just staying sat in sidings, exposed to the elements, rusting away, still adorned with red stars on their front. Some engines are in better condition than others, with some still capable of being moved in one piece, while others are rusted and rotten well beyond repair. Most have had smaller parts such as side rods, buffers, and number plates taken as scrap or souvenirs by thieves. While the majority of these engine graveyards aren't accessible to the public, at least not legally, there are a few that have been open to visitors and allow people to explore these rusted remains, such as the yard near Shumkovo railway station in Perm Krai. In the end, while many of Russia's abandoned engines are quite a sad sight for rail enthusiasts, let's just be glad that they were never used for their intended purpose. Are you aware of the butterfly effect? The theory that one small event, such as accidentally killing a butterfly, can drastically change the course of history? Because in the case of Grand Trunk Western 5629, it was a series of unfortunate events that ended up causing its tragic demise. The biggest culprit, however, wasn't a derailment or being replaced by diesel power, but possibly someone moving a fridge. Built in 1924, number 5629 was one of the 5 K4A class locomotives built by the American Locomotive Company to pull passenger services and fast freight on the Grand Trunk Western Railroad. It had a relatively uneventful service life, ending its career by pulling a special excursion train for rail enthusiasts in 1959, before being sold for scrap along with the rest of the K4As. It was rescued from the cutter's torch in 1960 by Richard Jensen, a long-time train enthusiast who'd saved his money with the goal of buying an engine of his own. Over the next year, Jensen and several volunteers spent their spare time getting 5629 back into working order. By 1962, it was in service again, pulling special excursion trains for rail fans, with Jensen acquiring a larger tender for it in 1966 to allow it to run long-distance trips. In September of the same year, Jensen also acquired engines 5632 and 4963 from the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, with plans to run additional day trips with the engines. Both were stored at an old roundhouse belonging to the Chicago and West Indiana Railroad, as Jensen had become close friends with the railroad's president and was able to negotiate a deal. In 1968, however, the CNWI's president stepped down, and in 1969, new management wanted to demolish the roundhouse, giving Jensen only a few months to move his engines and the boxcars full of tools and spare parts. The engines and boxcars were moved to another yard, with the CNWI denying Jensen permission to inspect the rolling stock. By September, the CNWI illegally sold the engines and equipment to a scrap dealer. Jensen tried his best to get the engines back, even willing to pay the scrap value of them, but was declined. 5632 derailed while being shunted at the scrapyard in 1972, and so was cut up there and then. 4963 meanwhile was put into storage while the scrapyard figured out what to do with it. Jensen immediately filed a lawsuit against the CNWI for effectively selling his property without consent. Luckily, 5629 had been out on a tour when the ordeal happened, meaning it had avoided the fate of its fellow engines. Things, however, still weren't looking good. The loss of his engines and subsequent legal battle was putting Jensen in financial debt. On top of this, more and more railroads were unable to provide insurance or passenger cars for 5629's excursions, despite them often being sold out, and so by the end of 1969, Jensen was unable to run any more trips. An excursion from Chicago to Logansport was planned in 1971, but Penn Central backed out of providing the passenger cars. Cars were instead provided by the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific Railroad and the Milwaukee Road. However, arguments over insurance led to Jensen rescheduling the trip. After further conflict from Penn Central and Amtrak, the trip was cancelled, and Jensen got little of his money back. Customers that bought tickets were offered a free ride on another excursion or a refund, but some passengers felt cheated enough to file a lawsuit against Jensen, further adding to his financial troubles. Supposedly, he'd give $20 to anyone who approached him in person and said they'd paid for a ticket. For the next few years, Jensen kept 5629 in storage while organizing his finances and fighting several legal battles, mainly the Chicago and West Indiana Railroad for scrapping his engines. Then, in 1977, something happened that doomed 5629. Jensen was helping a friend move a fridge up to a third-floor apartment when he fell down the stairs, critically injuring himself and severely damaging his back. The medical bills, combined with his building legal fees, meant that he was unable to pay the storage costs for 5629, and so he began desperately searching for anywhere that would let him store his engine and equipment on their property. He eventually made a deal with the Rock Island Railroad, and 5629 was moved into a rotting old roundhouse at the Blue Island Freight Yard in Illinois. In the meantime, in 1979, Jensen had managed to squeeze a settlement of $707,000 from the Chicago and West Indiana Railroad, with an additional $1 million in punitive damages, though naturally the CNWI appealed the order. Even though he hadn't gotten a payment from the case yet, Jensen could see that damage done to his engines at the hand of the railroad was worth some serious money he desperately needed thanks to his hospital bills. In 1980, the Rock Island Railroad was liquidated and taken over by Metra Commuter Rail. Metra, wanting to demolish the old roundhouse, moved 5629 into the middle of the yard and left it there, ordering Jensen to move it. At this point, Jensen hadn't paid his rent since Metra's takeover of the yard, and so they weren't entirely in a cooperative mood. When Jensen went to inspect the engine, he found the rails in front and behind it had been pulled up, and that various parts were missing from the locomotive, taken by yard workers likely wanting a souvenir. With little to no money left to move it, Jensen realised that if he left 5629 where it was, Metra would be forced to scrap it. And because it was still legally his property, he could then sue Metra for destroying his engine and get a massive payout, similar to what had happened with 5632 and the C&WI. 5629 was missing several bearings and other critical parts, meaning it was unsafe to move anyway, so he felt he might as well go for the money. For the next 6 years, Jensen kept removing parts from the engine, making it harder and harder to move until 1986, when Metra got fed up of waiting and filed a lawsuit against Jensen. The court ruled that unless Jensen moved 5629, Metra would be allowed to dismantle it. Upon hearing this news, the Illinois Railway Museum, Mid-Continent Railway Museum, and multiple preservation groups approached Jensen with offers to buy the engine. Even Metra wanted 5629 to be preserved, themselves having donated 2 old interurban cars from the Chicago South Shore and South Bend Railroad to the South Elgin Trolley Museum. Jensen, however, declined every offer he was given. He wanted that massive payout. By June of 1987, Metra banned Jensen from entering their yard as they feared his constant removal of parts would make 5629 a safety hazard. Because it was on their land, Metra wanted to get rid of the engine, but because it wasn't their property, they couldn't legally take ownership of it. And so, on the 1st of July, a judge finally gave the order for Metra to scrap the engine. Jensen put in an appeal, but the court swiftly rejected it. Metra, with no other choice, contacted the Erman Howell division of the Luria Brothers Scrap Company, ironically the same company that had scrapped 5632 15 years prior. On the 14th of July, work began cutting up 5629. Crowds of people came to watch, and local police had to escort some spectators off the property. On the 20th, what was left of the engine was loaded onto a truck and taken away. Jensen filed a lawsuit against Metra, demanding compensation for cutting up his beloved engine, only for him to lose the case and further add to his legal fees. The gamble didn't pay off. All 3 of Jensen's locomotives were officially scrapped. He was swamped in both legal and medical debt, and the Chicago and Western Indiana Railroad's payout was still pending, leaving him broke and one of the most despised men by the entire American rail fan community. He passed away 4 years later in 1991, aged 59. There is, however, a silver lining to this story. Engine 4963 was still in one piece. Plans to cut up the engine were announced in the autumn of 1991, but the Illinois Railway Museum quickly stepped in, exchanging it for 5 Northwestern steel and wire 080 shunting engines. 4963 was moved to the museum, cosmetically restored, and put on static display, remaining there to this day. The story of Richard Jensen and his engines has since become infamous in the railfan community. While many think of him as a selfish old man who only wanted the money, in reality it was his medical bills that pushed him to gamble 5629 for a payout. Was he right to do it? That's for you to decide. But it does make me wonder, if he hadn't moved that fridge, if he hadn't fallen down those stairs and gotten stuck in medical debt, would 5629 still have ended up scrapped? I suppose we'll never know. Just remember to be careful next time you're moving a fridge. You wouldn't expect the scrapping of machinery to be a blessing for an enthusiast of anything mechanical, but in the 1960s and 70s, there was one scrapyard that could only be described as a blessing in disguise for those interested in steam preservation. In 1955, British Rail put into effect their plans for modernisation, with the intent of replacing their 16,000 steam locomotives with newer diesel and electric-powered locomotives. They also planned to reduce their number of freight wagons from 1.2 1.25 million down to 600,000. They started by replacing smaller shunting and branch line locomotives, but by 1958 the British Transport Commission wanted to accelerate the process of disposing of their steam locomotives. Because British Rail couldn't cut up the engines fast enough, they decided to outsource the job to scrap merchants. The Woodhams Brothers scrapyard in Barry, Wales, was contracted with scrapping many steam locomotives that worked on the western region of British Rail, mostly engines formerly built by the Great Western Railway. They started by scrapping 10 engines and eventually got their hands on more, as well as some freight wagons. The manager of the yard eventually realised that it was quicker and more profitable to break up the freight wagons than the engines, so they turned their attention to the wagons. They still kept purchasing locomotives with the intention of breaking them up, but most of them were left in sidings to rust while attention was focused on scrapping of wagons. By 1964, the Woodham brothers had agreed to scrap several other locomotives and wagons belonging to the southern region of British Rail, formerly Southern Railways. These too were left in sidings to rust while the yard focused on breaking up wagons. Seeing an opportunity, many railway enthusiasts raised money and flocked to Barry in order to try and save as many engines as they could. The engines were sold at scrap value plus VAT and were towed from the scrapyard by British Rail to their new homes. Most of the engines in good condition were purchased, but as time went on, even engines that were corroded or rotten were saved from the cutter's torch. Because the rails in the scrapyard were part of an old freight yard, they eventually broke from the engines being shunted around, causing some of the engines to derail and others to end up with damaged wheels. After this, British Rail refused to tow the engines along the main line, and so any engines that were purchased had to be towed away from the site by road. This still didn't stop people from buying engines and spare parts from Barry, with a small organisation formed in 1979 called the Barry Steam Locomotive Action Group, to help potential buyers purchase the remaining 100 or so locomotives. The influx of interest in the engines did however cause problems for the Woodham brothers, as many people broke into their yard over the years not only to see the engines, but to steal nameplates, numbers and souvenirs from them. It got so bad that they ended up having to hire security guards to monitor the yards at night. Eventually, by 1980, most of the engines were gone, with a few left over as tourist displays or simply too rotten to restore. A total of 297 engines were sent to Barry to be scrapped, but rather remarkably, only 84 were ever actually scrapped, as a total of 213 engines were rescued from the yard. Roughly 150 of these engines were restored and have since ran again in preservation, including LMS Staniers, Southern Rail Pacifics, British Rail Standards, and many Great Western Halls, Kings, Manors, as well as a vast array of tank engines, with most of them currently out of service and awaiting overhauls. One of the engines rescued from Barry was number 5972, Alton Hall, which was rescued in 1981 and after it was restored became famous for being the engine that pulled the Hogwarts Express in the Harry Potter films. Many scrapyards focus on cutting up engines without giving them a chance to be preserved, so despite being a rather unfortunate end for some engines, the Barry scrapyard ironically ended up being the perfect place for engines to be saved. I guess the moral of the story is, just because you're in a bad place now, doesn't mean it won't get better in the future. Subscribe for more.